two to web three.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the LFG podcast. I'm Ian Horn, and today we're taking a look at one of the most fascinating aspects of fintech life, and that is company culture. So for this one, I've brought an awesome guest to the show in the form of Jenna Baker, Chief People Officer at Griffin Bank. Jenna is going to tell us about the culture she's building at Griffin and offer some tips for startups and scale-ups that are trying to get workplace culture right. So Jenna, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. Excited to have this conversation. It's probably my favorite topic to talk about. So I think we'll have a really good chat today.
Yeah, I think it's one of my favorites too. I think everyone can get involved in a conversation about office culture. I think everyone has like good stories to tell and also nightmare stories to tell. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's such a compelling topic. Also, just some context, anyone who's just joining, I usually do these from my study. Today, I'm actually in an office. This wasn't deliberate, but I feel like it's fitting. And the other thing you might notice is I have a bit of a lisp today because I've had some dental work done. So, hey, just enjoy that. Have some fun with it, and we'll carry on as normal. Anyway, Jenna, let's get started because you're Chief People Officer at Griffin. That's a job title that I think people would have heard before, but maybe don't know exactly what it entails. So could you talk us through, who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So, like you said, the Chief People Officer role can mean lots of things to different people. But for me, it's a super interesting role where you're almost like the co-creator of the culture with the CEO. So you're dealing with everything that would fall within what you would expect within a people function, but you're also thinking a little bit like a designer and a product leader around, what is the experience you want people to have? What is the people system that you need to build for this company to succeed and to win and to scale? So like an interesting way that we position it at Griffin is the people function is the cultivate function, which I think captures the essence of what we see ourselves as being here to do, which I think is really helpful. And then in our team as well, we adopt this product mindset so that we're always thinking about what's the mission of our team, and the way that we articulate that is like, how do we make winning inevitable, which might not be the typical mission statement we would expect for a people function, but for us, it drives our focus and drives our activity towards how do we make the organization more effective, not how do we improve bits and pieces around the edges. So I think it's a really influential, fascinating role to have. So I always feel very lucky that I get to do this role, but also specifically that I get to do it at Griffin.
So Jenna, I mean, a number of people listening to this might be thinking, why would I hire a Chief People Officer? I mean, of all the C-suite titles, it's perhaps one of the more obscure ones. I think it's fair to say that. So how would you respond to that kind of sentiment?
Well, I think it's an interesting one because it's something that does come up often. But I would say like a good Chief People Officer brings the same discipline to people decisions as a CFO would bring to financial ones. But if you think about the decisions a Chief People Officer makes, they are financial and commercial decisions. So if you're spending like 70 to 80% of your monthly burn on people costs, you're going to want to make sure that that investment has some kind of return, that someone's looking after it, that like whether it's because you've created the conditions for people to perform at their best, it's all of those different types of things. And I think if you think about it that way, it's hard to imagine why you wouldn't want to have a Chief People Officer. Because what I've also found is that when you talk to founders, they often rank culture in one of the top 3 things that they care most about. So like pretty much everyone believes that it's a source of competitive advantage, if not the greatest source of competitive advantage there is. So I don't think it's necessarily about convincing founders that the role should exist or that culture is important. It's about how do they see the value in having a partner that will take this vision that they already have and turn it into something super practical and scalable, rather than leave them to potentially like carry it alone. Because the scale of human challenge can be really messy, and sometimes it can be tempting to hire like the people role at a more junior level, and sometimes that works really, really well and the person flourishes and grows with the company. But often it can mean reaching for like best practice answers, which might mean like more procedure that you don't actually need, rather than actually nurturing the like principles that sit underneath the culture that are what really matters. So if you have someone in the exec team that cares about building a scalable people system more than building process, they're going to want to make sure that like they're thinking about the types of things that are going to accelerate pace, that are going to make the place more enjoyable to be, rather than just adding different features that add drag accidentally. So I think it's an interesting one, but the way I would frame it is very much like the chief people officer role is like as financially and commercially orientated as any of those that you might otherwise think are naturally that way.
I mean, definitely an interesting take. As you say, there's different ways to be a chief people officer in different cultures at fintechs. And I find it really interesting what you say about it being focused on performance. I think some people would look at a chief people officer role and think it's about making sure people are kind of bedded in. And I don't want to say having a nice time. That sounds really soft and naive, but it is kind of there to make sure that people are welcome and feel like they're enjoying the place. But it's interesting you're gearing it towards performance. I mean, to build on that, I mean, in your perspective, what does great culture at a growing fintech company actually look like?
Yeah, again, I guess people will have different definitions, but I'll share the way I think about it anyway. So essentially, I see it as a set of very deliberate choices that hold up under pressure. So, for example, that high agency and trust are actively designed for rather than they just happen organically or just assumed in the background. It also means that talent density doesn't slip. So you hear people talking a lot more about talent density now more than ever in this era we're in. But it's particularly important when you have a role that's hard to fill, or there's like a massive amount of urgency, or you've had a team that's been intact, like the early team's still intact. Like you really do have to think about, do we have like the highest concentration of like performance that we need to have to achieve what we need to achieve? And in a regulated fintech in particular, a great culture is one that makes people feel safe to talk, to speak up, to tell the truth about risk. Because if any of that type of stuff goes unseen or like flies under the radar, it definitely sends some alarm bells around like the healthiness of your culture and whether or not it's particularly effective. So like another way of thinking about it is if your culture only works in good weather, then it's maybe potentially more vibes and culture. Because what you really want to be able to do, and what I think is a hallmark of a really great culture in fintech and outside of fintech, is how do you make decisions? How do you run meetings? How do you hire? How do you pay? Because all of those things help explain the practical reality of how your culture translates into day-to-day experience. And that, for me, is the thing that actually makes a culture great. It's like being able to articulate it in meaningful, tangible ways.
Yeah, the two things you mentioned right at the start there that I think are really fascinating. The first is trust. You know, I think a lot of people like to think they have a high trust workplace, but it's not always the case. And I think when you have a startup, which starts with a vision of one person or three or four people, it must be really difficult to relinquish some of that control and let other people shape the company. So how do you actually encourage that kind of environment of trust where people feel like, people are allowed to work, but also to do their own thing and create their own um, their own path through the company?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess it stems from the founders. There's a lot of things in these kind of early stage fintechs or founder-led businesses do. So the way David and Alan articulate it is that basically these they see themselves as basically unemployable, but have done their best to build a company that they would actually want to work for. And there's a lot of truth in that. So for them, that has meant creating a place with radical transparency and trust, like built in from the very earliest beginning of Griffin. And like as you evolve, you're right in saying that it's difficult to maybe let go of that to other people. And I think you're finding or touching on something there, which is founder mode, which is something else that's been talked about in our industry. And, the way that we think about it, or the way that we think about it at Griffin, is that David and I are like co-designers of our culture. So he has created and holds this vision. And then I see my role as staying close enough to him to almost sort of like mind meld with it. So like if I get even more maybe like poetic for a moment, it's almost like if you have like a forest and the sea, and both of those habitats are like really, really strong and really interesting individually. But when the ecosystem joins, it's when all of these different ideas flourish and co-create together. And that's what that sort of relationship between the CPO and the CEO particularly like feels like at its best. It's like the dynamic between you is like merged these two different perspectives in a really powerful way. And I think that relationship between these two roles is particularly critical, particularly in a founder-led company, because regardless of whether you intend for it or not, the culture will naturally come downstream from the founder and from those early hires. So I don't see like my role as inventing culture independently from David. It's very much like creating and building this shared instinct so that either of us understands like the direction or nudge that it needs to take in order to be ready for where we're going next. Because a lot of people think about culture as something that needs protected. And I can understand that. But I think if you think that way, you're losing the opportunity to be thinking about the future and how it needs to evolve, because it will, as each year goes by, start to shape with every new hire you bring in differently, unless you've been really intentional about, who you've hired. Um,
Yeah.
an interesting shorthand way we have that empowers everyone within Griffin, not just like the relationship between David and I, is this concept of the smell of death. So if you notice something that is,
I mean, that's great. Sorry, that's a brilliant term.
there's
Do
lots of like
explain, but
decisions.
I got to jump in
Yeah,
there.
totally. Yeah, it's like one of those things again that's been there from the like very early days that like the founders have articulated, but it's really memorable, which is why it's powerful. So it's basically encouraging people if they see or notice something that feels off, that if it's like a project that's going to fail, if it's like behavior that feels like sick, you need to speak up. Like you're actively encouraged to say something to the person that needs to hear it. And I think that's a really powerful way of like keeping the culture as the one that you want it to be, because we have to trust everyone that they're also going to speak up when stuff starts to not feel right.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, how you say you obviously have an ongoing conversation about culture, and it's not a fixed thing, and it evolves over time with the company. How frequently do you have that conversation?
Well, I feel like so many decisions and discussions like involve culture, whether or not you're saying this is a conversation about culture. Like if you're deciding how you're going to give feedback to someone, if you're deciding what roles you're going to hire or not, they're like org design decisions. So many different day-to-day decisions, whether like directly people related or not, involve culture indirectly. So I think it just becomes part of the fabric of um like the intangible thing that flows through everything really. And then interestingly, though, we are looking at our own values at the moment, which has just really happened through recognition that the company has evolved in a slightly different way. And perhaps the way we have like codified our culture at the moment doesn't fully capture it. So it's a really interesting conversation because we are more directly talking about like, is this behavior the one that we feel covers what we're trying to articulate, or is it something else? But we've involved the whole team in that conversation as well, so that everyone has a chance to say and shape, like, actually, no, I think you're wrong there. And that's the great thing about Griffin's culture is that people will be really open about their views, which I think is a really healthy sign.
Yeah, and to go back earlier on, I said that there were two things you said that were interesting. I've done one of them. The other, you mentioned talent density. I think that's a really interesting concept because, one of the big themes coming out in fintech over the last year or two, especially with the rise of AI, but even before that, when you look at other tech companies like your WhatsApps and so on that grew massively with very small teams, how do you keep tracks of whether or not you've got talent density, especially across different roles? Because it must be, you're looking for standout performers in every single department. How
Mm-hmm.
do you how do you measure that? How do you stay on top of that?
Well, it's interesting in the sense that I feel like, we might talk about what keeps people at organizations as well. And one of the ways that you can do that is by making sure that the people that you get to work alongside are incredible. So like in the top 5 or 10% of the people they've ever worked with. That's like one of the best things you can do to make sure you keep the best people with you. Because if you've got someone who's an enabler, they're going to get like ultra frustrated with someone who isn't pulling the weight, who doesn't care enough, who like is okay with good enough. Like all of those different types of things are going to start to add friction in the system. So in the ways that you measure it, we do have like a way of uh, looking at performance at Griffin. We try to make sure that we don't overly engineer it either, because like again, we're still relatively small, and you can add layers and layers and layers of this stuff. So we try and think about what's the most lightweight but effective way of being able to understand that. And one of the ways that we do it is we have like exco sessions where we will talk about this like at least twice a year, and we will each bring people who we think have like more or less meeting like our definition of what like incredible transformative performance looks like. But we have a couple of like simple rules that are there or designed to mitigate bias. So for example, you can't mention someone in your own team if someone doesn't agree, then it's a veto, because like if someone doesn't agree that person, and it's not a collective decision. And the reason I think that is a particularly helpful way of doing it is, first of all, it gets the Exco team talking about performance and agreeing on a shared view of what that looks like at Griffin as well. It's not just like my view is different to like our chief revenue officers or whoever else. And it means that we can challenge one another in a very safe, open way. And that's been the way that we've done it so far, so that we do have a way of consistently identifying who this group of people are. But I would say that the way that Griffin is, although a lot of companies like to see a nice, neat bell curve of performance, like for the stage we're at, we have like an extraordinarily high like level of talent density. Like the team is incredible. So part of our challenge is like, how do we keep making sure that those people are stretched? Because if someone is, like an A player having transformative performance, like they technically shouldn't still be like in 2 quarters time. Like we should be pushing them to do more, to like learn, to grow, to develop. So it's a really interesting one. I think like there's definitely room for us to evolve our approach there. But the main thing is recognizing what it looks like and having consistent definition, I'd say.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting placement there as well, where obviously startups need experienced, capable, hardworking, A plus players. I get that. Where does that leave us in terms of, new entrants to profession, the pipeline of talent? Is it fair to say that maybe scaling up fintechs aren't really the place for that talent, or is there a way to bed in people like that?
I think for sure I think there's a huge opportunity. And something that we're really spending a bit of time on at the moment is how do we build a program that's meaningful, that does start to like think about how do we nurture talent from the earlier stages to build the future leaders in our team. Because I would say that we do have a pretty experienced team, but the balance for us is the capacity to be able to dedicate to the roles or the entry level type of roles versus hiring someone in who can have an immediate impact. But I don't think just saying we only need experienced hires is good enough. I feel like we owe it to the next generation to always know that there's more that we can learn from them than we can necessarily impart on them as well. Like I feel really passionate about that. I think it's something that we want to build, particularly in the engineering space where we do have room for people to progress through different levels and be able to actually demonstrate like capability growing over time. So yeah, it's a challenge though. I do see that more and more, you keep reading about the fact that these roles are just disappearing. And I think that that'll change once people realize that, how valuable, or remember how valuable these roles are and where they started from as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's stick with the kind of A plus talent angle, because fintech growth obviously requires serious work and commitment. I mean, how at the start we kind of touched upon this fine line, but how do you balance between elite performance and employee happiness and work-life balance and so on? I mean, if I can extend that further, you always see this talk on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn too much, by the way, but a lot of talk about 996 culture, for instance, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. How do you find this balance between people thriving professionally, but also personally?
Yeah, it's a super interesting one. I guess I don't really see that there has to be a tension between like happiness and performance. I think companies often treat them as a trade-off and then they end up with neither.
Mm.
Because like what they're really asking is how to balance like elite performance with consistently long hours. They aren't the same things, and that will actually probably make their culture quite fragile. Because we know like it's not too much of a reach to know that burned out people don't consistently create elite performance. Like it tends to maybe come in like peaks and then there'll be like a big dip. And I think that what people really need in that situation, and what I think we do really well around, is autonomy. And because a lot of this long hours or like intensity element is about control. So when people talk about work-life balance, what they really want is some semblance of control. Because if someone's working long hours by choice because they're like deep in the flow, because they love what they're doing, they have a really interesting problem to solve, and they just like, I'm locked in. I'm just going to solve this now. We're just going to like work through this weekend, and that's because that's what I want to do. But it's more about like when people feel like they're being forced to do it, or there's an expectation or surveillance or monitoring, it starts to feel like they're just a part of a machine. And I don't think anybody really wants to feel that way. So like one of the ways that we do that here is we do give people complete agency over the hours they work. There's no 9 to 5. Like if you feel like you've done your job, you've done like enough that you want to do, you're able to just do what you want and you don't have to necessarily explain yourself. So I don't necessarily think that's the thing, but then the emergence of the 996 stuff as well is
Mm.
really interesting because it's almost like an emergence of this like very intense form of hustle culture, which has always been there. And like obviously working in a startup, the expectation that comes with that is like intensity of some form. Like I've worked in startups 20 years, so like I get it. Like I know that it's not for the faint of heart. But one thing I do respect about 996 is the honesty of it. So if they're saying like this is how we want to work, like that's up to them if they want to work that way. But I do think it measures the wrong thing because it's basically
Yeah.
shorthand. Like inputs are what matters. So like hours and the number of days and potentially your harm are ways of us being able to like indicate that we're going to have a better output. So it's kind of like dressing up hours and like hustle culture as a virtue rather than actually like, this is what we're going to take to win. And actually, this is what we're going to do to trust you. Because I think it's much more interesting from at least my point of view, from a leadership point of view, is to almost articulate what the moonshot is. Like, what's the dream? And like, how do we get there? What's the quickest, fastest, best, most effective way of getting there? And like, give people that like you're talking to like their heart as well as their mind. It's almost like you've got to find that thing that makes them feel like the work they're doing, that they're in the flow, like that they do genuinely care about it. And it can't be imposed on people. So I don't know. I just feel like I'd rather give the big vision and help people feel like they've got the agency to find the smartest way rather than prescribing that like hardcore mode is the only way to get there. Cause I'm not sure that's the case.
Yeah, I think you're so right, though. I think a big part of this is actually caring about the work and being driven by it. I think if you're
Yeah.
outside of fintech and you hear that kind of thing, it sounds like hell on earth, right? 996 sounds horrible if you're not bought into it, if you're not part of the company, if you don't have equity, maybe, or
Mhm.
you've never bought into something like that. So I do think it's one of these things where I guess the roles are self-selecting, but it's maybe right place, right time. Because I think many of us think many kind of high performers in fintech or people who have been in fintech for a long time have had stints in their career where they've worked those kind of hours for one
Yeah.
reason or another. And if it felt like the work was worth it, then fine. I mean, I'm sure some people will disagree quite strongly with it, but I think it
Yeah.
is very circumstantial, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, it's an interesting one. And it's like been interesting to see like the different opinions emerge on it. Like it tends to create quite a strong reaction. Um, so yeah, I just think it's like giving people agency over the hours they work. They want to work long hours, fine, but I don't think it needs to be the way to achieve success.
Yeah, I think it's how that's communicated and interpreted right as well. Because I
Yeah.
think when it's being flexible with your hours, let's be real. In a growing startup, the reality of that isn't you clock off early every day. This is not going
No.
to work, is it? But it is.
Yeah.
Maybe there's the occasional day where you need to do that, and that flexibility is appreciated.
Yeah, exactly. I think, like I said, it's like working in a startup comes with intensity. Like as long as you know that from the beginning, then you know what you're signing up to. I think it's just sometimes if people have an expectation of something different, it feels jarring. But I don't think the level of intensity needs to be to the extreme. But like I said, for some of the companies where they're advertised roles and they'll let a candidate see a different comp package if they want to go for hardcore mode. I like the honesty of that. At least they're being honest.
Yeah.
But like, I don't think that. I don't think it's. I don't think not doing that means you're not working hard. I
Yeah.
think just one way of defining what hard work looks like. But hard work doesn't always equal results. It's like hours are not the denominator of valuable output.
Yeah, you're right. I love the point you made about 996 perhaps measuring the wrong thing. I think that's a really interesting take on that. Let's move on to something else because we're talking about workplace flexibility. Another angle of that is remote working, and Griffin's a remote first company. So I guess managing culture when people aren't in the same place would have seemed like a completely alien concept maybe 8 or 9 years ago, whereas now it feels more normal. But even so, I think everyone's view on it is still quite different. So to your mind, how do you create an excellent remote working culture?
Well, the lucky thing with Griffin is that we've been remote first from the very inception. So back in like 2017. So what we haven't had to do is like engineer in-person things into remote culture. It's always been designed to work that way. And like one of the things for remote culture, but I actually think in all cultures, to be honest, even if you are in office, I still think this would be super valuable. The offsites are like oxygen for remote cultures, I would say. So like that's something at Griffin that we spend quite a lot of time thinking about and doing to make sure that like we are giving the culture the oxygen it needs from some in-person time, and finding the right balance of that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to ask you a little bit of a spiky question, because we're talking about, leaders that have shaped your vision of culture. You mentioned as well that you co-create the culture with David Jarvis, which is great. But when we talk about culture, we have to talk about the bad stuff too, and the things that we've experienced that haven't been so good. So, have bad leaders and bad managers kind of helped forge your vision of culture in the past? And also, you mentioned that David and the team have got to that point where they felt almost unemployable themselves and wanted to create an environment where they felt they would have thrived as employees. And I think that comes from bad experiences too, or at least being fed up of a certain type of work. So are there any kind of bad management or bad leadership things that you've deliberately avoided, and any kind of culture pitfalls that you've deliberately steered clear of?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like it's so right. Like so many of our formative experiences, like are characterized by observation. So when we feel as though we don't necessarily have the permission to talk, we're watching how other people do things. So a lot of my personal leadership philosophy has been shaped around recognizing it's like it might have been some experiences that didn't feel logical or they didn't feel right. And then you recognize in yourself, like if I'm ever in this position, I am never doing it that way. Like whether it's like things like micromanagement or like someone taking credit for your work or just like making you feel insignificant, like on a human level, if as well, like even outside of work, if you ever struggle to like fit in, whether it's like a school or university or wherever else, it might mean that as an individual, you make it your personal mission to make sure nobody in your company ever feels unwelcome. So all of these different experiences, like whether it's like on a human level or in a workplace, like shape who you are. And then when you have the privilege, because it is a privilege of like leading people, you need to remember those lessons that were forged early on. And also not to think of yourself as a finished article, because as we've like grown up, we've had all sorts of different like life experiences that also shape like who we are. Like maybe we've experienced like really horrible things ourselves that or really positive things ourselves that like make us have a different perspective, whether it's like becoming a parent or loss of a parent or all sorts of different like human messy things that happen to all of us. We're all shaped by all of the experiences we have. And I think that makes us become like super intentional about how we show up for our team, like what kind of leader we are for them. And then you mentioned pitfalls as well. I think the main pitfalls that I try and avoid based on my experiences are uh, like doing things the way that they've been done. So often that means things that bigger companies do that are sort of locked in as lore that you should follow, for example, like whether it's things like box grids for succession planning or like performative performance systems. They're like often quite seductive because it feels like, okay, it's a process. We can follow a process. But what they unintentionally do is remove like the layer of human judgment. So you're like, okay, we'll replace your judgment with the process, but actually what you want to preserve is as much space for people to be able to just exercise their good judgment as possible. So there's always a temptation to layer things or add things. But actually part of like the trick is like keeping things as lightweight as they possibly can be. And I think that's probably the pitfall, I would say, from a culture point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but feel that comes from people, entering fintech from larger institutions, right? People usually find their way with a major payments company, a bank, or something like that, and then they suddenly find themselves in a lean organization trying to grow. Is that usually the issue? Is that people are a bit institutionalized from other experiences?
Well, people coming from these larger organizations too, particularly in like functions I set of people, like what they can bring with them is like hugely valuable insight about a better way of doing things or a more rigorous way of doing things. So I'm not like saying everything out of the box that large companies do
Yeah.
is going to be like overly bureaucratic, but it's just being mindful that like lift and shift doesn't really always work. So you really do have to spend the time in the early days thinking about like, what does this company need and want? And sort of adjusting it to exactly the situation in which you find yourself. Because the people coming in from like these larger organizations have like really invaluable skills and expertise, but it's like finding the right balance between what we need versus and what we must do versus like what we could do. And I think it's sometimes like could do stuff more so. I'm talking from the position of people is optional. You don't need to like add layers and layers of things for them to work well.
Got you. And I'll go back to something else you said, which was you were talking about assessing your own performance and being kind of, leaders and managers needing to be able to reflect, to be able to evolve and be able to be honest with themselves. So I guess to put that straight to you, how do you manage your own performance?
How do you measure? I think often when you get to like exec roles as well, you don't have a leader as the leader you might be to your team. Like you have to be very autonomous and very self-aware. So I think in some ways you have to be your own worst critic. And I think that probably naturally happens because you have got to this position because you love what you do, you care about it deeply, and you want to do it really well. So I think all of those different ingredients mean that you set a really high bar for yourself because you know that the bar you set for yourself is the bar you set for your team. Like, for example, if I have someone who's not performing in my team, that reflects on me, or it should reflect on me because I'm the leader of that team. So you've got to always think about the team's performance is your performance. So that is the way that I think about it. It's like if my team aren't performing at the highest possible bar, then how can I say I am? And that's the way I look at it because I feel like your role is to help them thrive and like perform at their best. But luckily, my team are all brilliant, so I don't necessarily have this as a reality of like my day to day. But it's like a really, really helpful reminder, and I think every leader should think that way because it really puts into like shines a really clear light on how you should think about your own performance.
Got you. And let's look at the evolution of people management because we talked about this before we made this recording. And you said you actually nearly quit this career in your career path in your mid-20s, but changed your mind when you were able to impact culture rather than just fill in forms. Could you talk me through that?
Yeah, I think it's super interesting because I guess because of my age, my career, it's almost followed the same path as the evolution of the profession. So like early in my career, HR was still HR, personnel. It was very much like locked away in a room. And I don't know, it just kind of like made you feel like some kind of secretive cave troll where you were like pretty universally despised by the rest of the organization. No one really knew what you were there for. And the reality is something like hybrid teacher slash officer. And I remember just thinking like, why did anyone do this job? It's just like a little bit soul destroying. And then I was obviously seriously doubting my choice of career because I went into it with like the interest in psychology and design and feeling like, okay, I can see how these two things mesh together, how it could make organizations successful. I thought, and then I realized that maybe I just needed to find somewhere a bit more progressive. So I ended up getting an interview for a fintech startup. I met the founder. I could see that we had the same kind of ideas around a people function that had started to emerge, obviously out of Silicon Valley at the time, and we're landing in the UK. And it was obviously a very different way of building a people function. The remit was very much like start from scratch, build it as it should be. And I found that really exciting. And I told myself though at the time, like if I don't get this job, then I'm just going to do something else entirely. Like this isn't for me.
Yeah.
But luckily I got it, and I got to like rewrite what that function was, to work together with the founder, and then realized that was kind of my jam, I guess, was like designing things and designing systems, not producing policies or rules. Because I think, and I guess all of those early experiences in the fintech world shaped my belief that principles always beat out rules. So, and I think that for me, it taught me that, like working in a founder-led company where someone really cares about what you're there to do, it's just so refreshing. And like being able to build a culture around their very early initial vision and turn it into something scalable is such a fun, exciting thing to get to do. And yeah, basically I've got to see it move from like those early stage of what it was into becoming like an architect of how a company succeeds and wins. And that's like, it's been so interesting to see in 20 years, I guess, being such an early profession it is compared to some of the others.
Definitely. I think the last decade or two have been really transformational in terms of people management and even the recognition of office culture. I mean, it's always existed. Well, it's existed as long as offices have existed, but
Yeah.
the conversation has really moved along. I mean, again, we're millennials, right? So we've seen the short-lived peak of beanbags in the office and pizza Fridays and all that kind of stuff, which at first was seen as nice and is now pretty maligned and is seen as a sign of out-of-touch thinking. But even the end of office drinking culture. I mean, when I started my career, it was very much expected that I'd be in the pub at least one night a week. That appears to be gone. I mean, what are the biggest changes you've noticed in workplace culture since you've been in the kind of people role?
Yeah, I think COVID broke the spell, didn't it, really? I
Mhm.
remember at the time, so many companies were not sure how they would preserve, as they saw it, their culture when they were no longer going to be together on one place, because it was almost like the office, which is like a stage set. So if that was the definition of what made work good, then what's left? Like, what about the actual job? Because that was actually really what mattered all along. Like, if the job wasn't interesting or exciting or challenging or fun, didn't matter how many free snacks or how good the coffee was. And I think everybody kind of came to that realization that offices have their place and like beautiful spaces have their place. And I do think they can influence how people think and feel while they're in them. But I don't think it's necessarily like the way to build a great culture anymore, whereas it was seen as the way to build a great culture then. And I think I know what you mean about drinking culture. That was definitely a feature early on. And I think
Mhm.
it's almost with the swing that we see from different generations towards slowing pace down, even to even doing hobbies that are a little bit more gentle and a little bit more um like artisanal in a way where there is like
Yeah.
they don't necessarily feel the need to like have that drinking culture to blow off steam. It's more about how they recover. And I think that's a really interesting shift that has started to happen um, over time. Yeah.
Yeah, let me offer some slightly tabloid framing for once.
Yeah, sure.
Is the old world of office culture dead?
The old world of office culture, I think like the office is still a visual representation of your brand. So there's still a place for it. In my opinion, which is obviously very specific, not very many people, not all agree with me, given the like droves of organizations that are forcing people back into the office. People want control over where they work. And I think mandated office culture is dead. Yes, in my opinion. I don't think it gets the best from people. And I don't think it's necessary. It feels very performative given what we've now learned over the last like 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, and there's one question I forgot to ask you as a follow-up, which I want to bring in before the final question. And we were talking about remote working culture and what people actually want, and actually office culture being dead and all this kind of stuff. Offsites. Let's look at offsites because they're increasingly becoming a big part of a company's culture plan, their strategy planning, all of this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
What do you think is the key to creating a great offsite for a team?
We love an offsite at Griffin. It's like one of the highlights of the year when we run them. So a few things we've learned along the way. We've actually created this, Annie, our people experience partner, has created this like, super useful playbook that's essentially all the lessons we've learned, like over all of them, which is like such a good resource that we have, which I'm happy to share if anybody wants it. But off the top of my mind, I would say there's probably like three things that I think are really important. The first one is thinking about the small things are the big things. So we're thinking about from the beginning, how do you want people to feel? The small touches that feel unnecessary, but make it go from being ordinary to like something extraordinary. So like keeping the novelty factor high and not just killing all the stuff that feels unnecessary is really important because it is all of the small things that make difference. The second one is not over engineering the agenda. So it's tempting, especially if you haven't been together in person for a while to like cram it. Like, let's do all these things. But actually, no one's going to take anything away from it. Like, and so much connection happens in all of the gaps in between the agenda, scheduled agenda. So I think finding the right balance between scheduling on the agenda and natural connection is super important as well. Like letting that happen and not being forced. And then the third one is immersion. So almost creating like a temporary world for people to step into where they can shed all of the worries that they maybe came with, like, and just be present in the moment. So it feels like they've not stepped into some sort of generic corporate offsite. It's like, this is our offsite. This is like our space. I think is like really important. So all of those different ingredients together, I think, which stand you in good stead if you're thinking about running one yourself.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to take on there, and it's a huge logistical lift as well. But
Yes.
where do you host them? Do you keep them in the UK? Do you take them abroad? Because I know some people do destination, get-togethers. What's your preference?
Yeah, we've had both. So for the time being, we're running them mostly in the UK. So our last ones were in London and Bristol, and the next one, the main one we do might be in Edinburgh. I feel like if I say that enough, it's going to happen because I'll say I'm in Edinburgh. That would be nice. I know the city well. But yeah, we try to go somewhere where like is not too much of a logistical lift to get the team together. Because although we do have people based remotely in places outside of the UK, everyone is mostly within the UK. So something that's not like a total lift to get everyone to, again, somewhere that's got like high novelty factor interesting. So with Bristol and with places we try to go, we try to like spend a bit of time thinking about what that city brings, like what would tell us we're in this city rather than anywhere else. So like for Bristol, for example, we spent a bit of time learning about like the history of graffiti art and Banksy, and actually like all of those different types of things linked to Griffin in ways that people wouldn't expect. So it's all of those different types of things that like give us the idea of like where we would choose to host it, for example. But yeah, we have like big dreams for our offsites. So as we grow, we hope to like make them better every single time.
Great stuff. And let's finish with what I think is possibly the big question, which is, what does a modern employee actually want? There's so many angles you take with this, but just I'm going to open it as a big, broad question. What does a modern employee actually want?
Well, they probably want all sorts of different things. So a good place to start if you're someone listening to this is ask people what they want. But my interpretation is people often want a combination of three things. And it's like quite simple. They would like mastery, autonomy, and purpose. And obviously that comes from Dan Pink's very, very famous novel, but I think it does hold true. People most of the time, in my experience, want to feel like they're trusted to do amazing work and just be able to get on with it. And also on a more human level, to know that if something in your life outside of work goes sideways, as it does, as we know, like
Okay.
life happens, that the people around you like will care about being there for you, not just because a policy says you get X many days off or you're supported next week, but just because they really care about you as a person. And I think that's what people want to feel. Like they want to feel something and feel that the people that they work alongside, they're not just a number or an employee. I also hate that word. Um,
Mhm.
and I think as well, like if we think about fintech for a moment, I think people want to come and do, when we talk about the purpose element of that and the mastery element of that, people want to come and do like super interesting work, even if it is intense, like we talked about earlier. I think the people that thrive in our industry are those who are very like intrinsically motivated in the sense like they're not here because they want the next job title or um but they're here because they want to build something that matters. I think there's something in that as well, for sure. And I think
Yeah.
plays a big part of that for sure. It's like we sort of touched on earlier a little bit as well. Like if you're going to work this hard or put in this much effort or time or output or create or generate these amazing things, you want to know that later down the line it will be recognized in some way. So I think being able to have like a meaningful equity slice is always important for sure.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because you listed lots of really good stuff. But I was about to say, where's the equity? But I think
Yeah.
now that you've covered it, I think it's so true. People need a reason to believe in what they're doing, don't they? And it speaks to the point we were talking about earlier, which is if you're going to be working hard and working at an elite level, there needs to be something about the work that captivates you and drives you. And I think we've maybe looked at the people officer, the chief people officer kind of roles in the wrong way in the past. It's not about making sure everyone is having a lovely time. It is actually driving elite performance, as you've kind of alluded to. Jenna, look, it's been really fascinating talking with you. Is there anything else you would add before I wrap this one up?
I don't think so. I think one thing I would say is that the culture happens whether you consciously try to do anything with it or not. So it's just thinking about like how do you involve it intentionally. There's some practical tools and resources that you can reach out to as well, reach out or find as well. So OpenOrg is a great one. It has like a total open sourced playbook from all sorts of companies who share their different resources. We're happy to share things. And the CPO community is also very open and welcoming. So if you have a challenge, it's always comforting to know that someone has already gone through this problem and solved it and will be willing to share their stories. I always find that people are very happy to share their stories and like help other people learn from their experiences. So if you are in a position where you don't have one, I think you'll always find like a very welcoming ear to listen to what's on your mind and help steer you if you need help.
Amazing. Thank you, Jenna. Look, it's been great having you on the podcast. Really fascinating to hear about what a chief people officer does and what you do at Griffin. I feel like this is one of these areas that we just don't hear enough about in fintech, even though it is so relevant to people and people are probably spending a good chunk of their time on LinkedIn posting about it. You don't often see it called out quite so explicitly. So really, really great to get your take on how you're driving success and how you're creating, the right workplace culture for people. So thank you, Jenna, for joining. And everyone who's been listening in, thank you again for listening to LFG. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel and the newsletter. I'm Ian Horn, and it's been a pleasure. I'll see you again soon.
Raising funds, speaking the club, drinking coffee, and fighting the fraud. LFG, turn it up and come with me. Big moves, natural synergy, say it loud. LFG, pull up and listen in. Press play, chase the mystery, ride that wave from Web 2 to Web 3.